welcome. The second part on the lectures on the figure of hanging, automata. The first one, ornament. That's already a big question. That how do we, within the figure of hanging, how do we actually make a construction that allows ornament and automata to be discussed in the same framework? That's a massive issue. We have been discussing parts of it, many parts in this lecture. First, Hephaestus himself, the ornament as a sense of overworking, hypergon, which already states that the internal movement transfigures and becomes an appearance. The other is, of course, that we see very quickly a connection between ornament and movement. Bewegtes bijwerk, obviously, that's one of them. That ornament is always sort of related to movement, but in reverse as well, that movement is related to appearance or workings, a special type of workings, a performative type of workings that turns into a shining, and that's a big issue. Obviously, also in the sense that ornament is not just appearance. It's this overworking is a form of halo. We've been describing this so often, a form of shining or radiance, which is an outward movement, that of the gift. So that's not a thing that withdraws. That's a thing that offers itself to consciousness, or that's itself part of consciousness. So it's an extensive notion. Of course, on the other hand, the other extensive notion is that of the limbs as an extension of the body toward movement. So there's an overlap in these models. One is extensive in the sense of appearance, the other is extensive in the sense of ready to move. And there's many issues that we will encounter, especially in the context of Hephaestus, that will have to do with this idea. Now, on the left, you see Hephaestus, as he's often depicted, as if there's nothing the matter. Just one of the Greek gods on his anvil, sitting on an anvil, bearded, and nothing wrong with his feet, if you look carefully. And on the right, you see just one of the very, very few depictions of Hephaestus, showing him with clubfeet. You see here the feet are distorted and turned backwards or sideways. There's only 2 or 3 images of Hephaestus showing that on vases. There seem to be older descriptions of Hephaestus where he's described as dwarfish. We'll get to that, but there's it's in itself, it's already a massive issue, because Hephaestus is the son of Hera and Zeus. I mean, you cannot get higher on Mount Olympus, from a very noble descent. And then he was born with misshapen feet. And Hera was so angry that she threw him into the ocean, and then he was saved by Thetis, and grew up in a cave. That's already important. One is this idea of the ocean is important, but also this idea of the cave, because that later turns into the forge. Why is this so important? This is something, the clubfeet. Why are the clubfeet so incredibly important? There's many connections of clubfeet, and what Hephaestus is actually doing. It's not just a simple story. I mean, often when we listen to the Greek mythologies or the Greek myths, we get like, oh, there's another story and another one and another one. They're connecting up, and one is cheating on the other. And that's how it goes. But there's a very, very powerful. He's the only one of all the gods that sweats. He's the only one of all the gods that has feet like that, and there are examples. One is that he's a smith god. We know him better as Vulcan when we come to the Roman Latinized version of the Greek gods. But it is Hephaestus, or in a Latin description, which is normally what we use, Hephaestus. You see here the description of Mircea Eliade in his book The Forge and the Crucible. Many gods or smith gods are dwarfish, and there's a few reasons why that is. One is that they're chthonic gods. That means they're earthly gods, and they're hidden deep in the mountains, and that's where they have their forge. And their hiddenness in the earth, of course, connects them to precious metals and to iron and bronze and all the metals that allow them to forge artifacts. And there's something else as well, is that there's always it's very difficult for these smiths or for these dwarves to actually become gods, and you don't see it very often. Hephaestus is one of the few. There's a number of different ones, but in general, the smiths do not become gods, and that's because of their crookedness. So the idea of and of course we know that from the idea of the forge and forgery and craft and craftiness, there's always an ambiguity in the notion of artifact or the making of artifacts, and that also makes them crooked, misshapen, because of their the fact that they can do one thing or the other. And I think, especially in the case of Hephaestus, this is important, because we normally, and this is a very good description of Eliade, because he describes how in the forge, with the hammering on the anvil, there is this notion of rhythm and percussion. And that links them to the singing of songs and rhyme. So see at the bottom you see the word Rijmschmied. That means a smith of rhyme, and that brings them to poetry. So the idea of the wordsmith is not just like a simple metaphor, but it has to do with this sort of darkened stage, this stage before appearance, when there's just sound. Sort of what we encountered in the jumping figure, when we talked about the rhythm analysis, and especially as a sound studio. And here we get something similar. And what you also see, what Eliade often describes, is that there's a link to shamanism and transfiguration. We discussed transfiguration in the case of Theseus, and the glowing, the transfiguration of Theseus in the Minotaur, and the refiguration of Theseus when he comes out of the labyrinth. So there's many connections between this sort of this ambiguity of artifact, and though the word poetry comes from poiesis, I made a note at the bottom of the page. Of course, that's how we know poetry is related to poiesis, as a sort of purified making. But that's not the word that's always being used in the case of Hephaestus. I'm using the name Hephaestus and Hephaestus sort of alternately, is the word metis. And metis means cunning. You actually never see the word poiesis in connection to the making of artifacts in relationship to Hephaestus. It's always a form of cunning, and cunning is especially the word metis means ingenuity or inventiveness or crookedness. There's this double idea of making, and that is one is sort of this moving from this dark forge to the glowing, to the making of appearances. But that's something else than just making things. It's the making of things as appearances. It relates them very close to the making of fakes and or falsification and forgery, obviously. So there we go. There's this area where you cannot make a clear distinction in the making of artifacts, because it moves away from the pure workings of nature, of physis and poiesis, into a sort of consciousness of work as an appearance, but also the making of appearances. Now let's look more closely at this. On the right in Greek, this is from Homer's, from the Iliad, where Hephaestus is described. Hephaestus here, there you see his name in Greek, and here you see this term amphigouais, and that means literally it means what is correctly translated by Samuel Butler is club-footed or lame at both feet. Amphi is both. Club-footed or lame at both feet. But that's not always the translation. Here you see another translation is the god of the two strong arms, which is not at all a literal translation of the word amphigouais, but it does mean that. And you very often see this translation of amphigouais as ambidexter, for instance. So look, extremely able hands, not just one but two able hands, as a mirroring of two unable or disabled feet, and that sort of goes together. This idea that Hephaestus cannot properly stand, and we'll hear about descriptions of that. Cannot properly stand, but there's an incredible ability in his hands, and that already says a lot about how Hephaestus is seen. Of course, we've been discussing Marcel Détienne and Jean-Pierre Vernon's book Cunning Intelligence, which is an extensive description of the notion of metis. But here is like there's one whole chapter on the feet of Hephaestus, where he has where they describe the feet of Hephaestus as having two aspects, two aspects that relate him actually to the water or to the ocean, since he was thrown in the ocean. So that is the crab and the seal, and the crab is an oblique mover. Always this beautiful word in French, oblique. A crooked mover, and the seal, especially on land. But they have a sort of double, double understanding of the seal. One is underwater, which is a very rhythmic swimmer, and on the land as a very disabled mover, and that brings him very close to the crab with this oblique movement, and that also relates Hephaestus to this dwarfishness or to this disability. And we know, for instance, that on the island of Lemnos, which had a cult of Hephaestus. He had two sons. Now that's not really correct that it's were his sons, but they were understood as his sons. The Kabairi, and the Kabairi actually come from Samothrace, and they were called on Lemnos. They were called the Hephaestoi, so that means the sons of Hephaestus, and they were dwarfs. They were quite monstrous. I'm saying this all like in between quotation marks, and there's also this relation to the island of Rhodes, where the Telchines were the metallurgists. So there's a lot of connections between animal connections that are sort of mapped by Détienne and Vernon, that link him to different islands surrounding the Greek peninsula, with all these different aspects of crookedness, but also like of sinuous rhythm, and a dwarfish past via the Kabairi. Hephaestus often described even as polymetes. Polymetes is even more cunning than cunning. It's a form of cunning that is really a form of ingenuity, and I think here we start to understand. Why Hephaestus has these clubfeet, because it means that instead of purely copying one object after another, he's well known for imagination and invention. So that's why there's a certain aspects of performance to his objects, and something that is new, and that means that there's not a straight copying in the sense of almost a mathematical copying of a translation from one thing to another, as if you're like copying it from an archive. No, there's something new, and there's no straight way of making something. There's no straightforward way of making something, or moving or transfiguring something from this state of work to the state of appearing, or bringing something into the light. So it's not just straight from memory that something is made. Everything that Hephaestus makes is what they either call daedala or métis, a form of cunning and invention and ingenuity. So there's a detour. There's a detour in the making. There's something that while you make it, there's a certain uncertainty. Is that English? There's a specific uncertainty that says, okay, this is not there yet. We have to invent it, and that means there's a risk. And that's in that sense that's no different from the curved free kick from Lionel Messi. It means that there's only crooked ways of making things. Right? There has to be necessarily be a crookedness, a detouring of making. There cannot be. It is not something that goes from the light into the light, right? It's not a form of pure reason, and then to another state of reason. There's no ground, right? So there's nothing to hold on to. So when Hephaestus makes his golden thrones or his webs or the shield of Achilles, all these are new. So there's a very specific sense of invention and creativity to what he makes, and it's actually a beautiful idea that this is born from disability and not purely from abilities. Right? It's not a reservoir of skill that just makes things. No. There's a specific uncertainty and risk involved. So that makes the magic of his marriage to Aglaia even more poignant. It is a bit of a crude image, but there's on the right we see a baby with clubfeet. On the left, the Aphrodite from Botticelli, but it's just to make this contrast. It's on the left we have the figure of shining things, so to speak, of gifts, of also of this je ne sais quoi, of this I don't know exactly what, and it is a very, very powerful towardness of the figure, a shining. And then on the right we have the secret of the maker of shining things. It is this not being able to stand, and yes, that points to an extreme skill of the hands, but it also points towards this that there are no straight ways of making things. So physically, Aglaia, I'm calling her Aglaia here, Aphrodite Aglaia, Charis in Homer, so it's one and the same figure. Aglaia and Hephaestus physically do not fit together at all, and that's why it's a bad marriage. That's why she cheats on him all the time, and he tries to catch her in flagranti, right? For instance, like with Ares, when she cheats on him with Ares, Aphrodite with Ares, and he builds this web of invisible threads to catch them during the act, which makes him a laughable figure. So we get that again, dwarves and the connection to laughter. So he's actually the only god who's being laughed at on Mount Olympus. But figurally they fit perfectly, and that's this incredible thing. And there's this magic of how they fit and non-fit. And I'm saying this over and over again. There's a specific quality in the not fitting, and as the same quality as that we know from disability, because we always think in fitness and especially grace, but this notion of grace is actually born from this jump in the gap. We know that from the jumping figure, of this crooked way or this curved shot that we have to follow. An extremer explanation of this is, of course, the fall of man on the left, the image by Titian. But there's this is normally referred to as the flourishing of sexuality, and Adam and Eve finding out that they have genitalia. That I think that's silly. It's there's something much deeper about it. And though I'm saying that almost all creatures and animals have this subtle form of non-fitting, and I even described it when we got to the dolphins, right, swimming underwater but breathing in the air. So there's this constant fluctuation between the two. There's this the ape, which has very able hands, but when you see it walking on the ground, it has the same type of walking of Hephaestus. This waddling back and forth form of walking. That's us. That's us. That's our falling from paradise is the falling from the monkey from the tree, and we always see it as this incredible evolutionary feat that monkeys and apes start to walk on two legs, while they actually seem more like they're having four arms. but that's us. That we are the most non-fitting of all creatures, and that's the casting from paradise. That's the fall of man, and the fall of man is so the fall of the monkey or the ape, and that's because if you compare our bipedal state, I mean, just think of the hands, how soft they are compared to, let's say, the claws of a tiger. Or if you compare our feet to the hooves of a horse, they're far too soft. So you get this soft, weak creature with these opposable thumbs, of course. But there's something that is extreme in this state of non-fitting. And Michel Serres would say that's why humans have history. That's true, but it is a history that's technical, and I think that's what's so interesting about André Leroi-Gourhan, who said, who was so clear that there was that this whole idea of l'homme sauvage, of this true man as a savage, as a natural man, as a natural human being, is a complete myth. And because man was never natural, we have never been human, says Donna Haraway when she paraphrases Bruno Latour. We've never been human, and that's exactly right. So the history of man is a technical history. We're bound to live technical lives, and that is our history. That is, and that's how we have been expelled from paradise. So, and that means we have always seeked not just tools but prostheses. In that sense, we are all disabled. Right? It's not correct to say that we are able humans, and then if we're like in this in a state of disability, that only then we're disabled. No, there is a form of disability that is fundamental to being a human being, and that's not natural, but that's this quest for artifice. That's also because I've argued before that grace is born from disability. It's exactly this entering of the gap, and it's not an extension of habit, which is habit means able, right? Habere, being able, and then extended into some kind of form of or a state of grace, which is some kind of form of pure ability or effortlessness. No, there's this friction, this breaking of habit into this state of not being fully in control and letting go, and that's this moment of disability. So it's fundamental to grace, and that means that disability again is fundamental to the finding of prostheses. And I've argued before that all the prosthetic is mimetic, and so we always we're caught in this loop of extending ourselves and absorbing that we mimic. So there's only one way of extending ourselves, is by incorporating our extension. It's not just like the extension is just added on to the self, but that what is other, that hammer or that car or these crutches or whatever, that needs to be incorporated. So there's a double route. There's one of extending, and there's one of absorbing, and I've compared that to the second state of the gift cycle, which is the state of Aphrodite, which is that of absorptive mimesis. So we always have this double movement. There's never in any figure there's a single movement. There's always a loop, and there's always a double. This prosthetic mimetic, and of course that brings us immediately to apery. I don't think it's any accident that apes in living in their hand space of the jungle are extremely capable of mimesis and imitation. That's not an accident at all. So that means that they extend themselves by mimesis, and so we will get many connections to Hephaestus here. Let me see. There's this is the Iliad again. This is the 18th book. It's not just like to show the Greek that's important, but I want to go very specific, very precise sentences where we get this description of him as being disabled, but also to descriptions where these ideas of shining or cunning, or sometimes called poikile in the sense of multicolored, variegated, or sometimes called daidalos, daidalon, daidaleon, daidaleia. In this case, it's daidaleia, which is a form of cunning. How that is related to movement, and especially self-movement. I think that's the most important, because at the beginning we said movement and object, and they relate to each other. They transform into each other, one from object to movement, calling that beauty, and the other one from movement to object, calling that grace, as a sort of pheno-axis of grace and beauty. That now becomes a sort of a new idea. This idea of the object now becoming an appearance via ornament, as a hypergon, as an overworking, and from movement to object as a form not just of motion but of self-motion. So it's really an extension and a transformation. So in that sense, they're really on two sides of the argument. It's not just like, oh, okay, there's appearance and there's motion. Sure, that too, but it's a very specific type of appearance. It's appearance as shining. And that's what we find in ornament, especially in the overworking of Hephaestus. And it's a very specific type of movement, which links very directly to automata and robots. So we get a connection between ornament and automata that seems so far-fetched. And how can you bring those two together? But they're really fundamentally connected. This is a small part when in the 18th book, where Hephaestus is making something in his forge. She Hera found him busy with his bellows, sweating and hard at work. This is a translation by Samuel Butler again. For he was making 20 tripods that were to stand by the wall of his house, and he set the wheels of God under them, all that they might go of their own selves to the assemblies of the gods. So he's making tripods, and the tripods can move by themselves. Okay, so that's an early form of robotics, so to speak. But there's something going on here, because there's no description of any mechanism. There's no description of any how does he actually make those tripods move by themselves? Except when you go to the Greek, it says ophra oi automatoi. Ophra means so that. Now let's look here. So there's gold involved. So he's making 20 tripods, and the chryseia is gold, and kukla is of course a cycle from round. Means wheel in this case. So the tripods that were to stand by the wall of his house, he set the wheels of gold under them, all that they might go of their own selves, so that they would go of their own selves. So the idea of golden wheels, of shining, actually makes them move by themselves. That's not two things. That's one figural mechanism. The shining of the gold directly links to the self-movement. Now, if you know Hephaestus, he never makes anything of iron, like for instance later the Norse gods, who see the making of the gold boar and the 9 golden rings as a failed gift, and only when a Mjolnir is made out of iron it becomes the perfect gift to the gods. And so that's a switch from gold to iron. We never see that in Greek mythology, especially not in when it comes to Hephaestus. It is the gold that works. It is the gold that works. So the overworking. I mean, we wouldn't think of it, of making these wheels in gold, but it's actually the gold that is the engine, the figural engine of the automaton. All the robots, all the automata that Hephaestus creates, silver dogs, golden thrones, golden chariots, the golden shield of Achilles, all these stoppers and movers are always made out of precious metals. It's either gold or silver. So that this is quite something. This is it's sort of the shining equates in self-movement. And one of the most beautiful descriptions is, I think I have to read that, and this is again Samuel Butler's translation. On this the mighty monster, that's Hephaestus, hobbled off from his anvil, his thin legs plying lustily under him. So that's the seal. That's the seal on land, flop flop, waddling around in the forge, hobbled off from his anvils, his thin legs plying lustily under him. He set the bellows away from the fire and gathered his tools into a silver chest. He then took a sponge and washed his face and hands, which is unbelievable for gods, obviously, because they're these ideal figures. His shaggy chest and brawny neck, he donned his shirt, grasped his strong staff, and limped towards the door. There were golden handmaids also worked for him, and they were like real young women, with sense and reason, voice also and strength, and all the learning of all the immortals. So what do we have here is there's this disabled figure, can hardly walk. There's two disabled legs, 2 club feet. And on each side of him, there's a golden female robot, a Chrysai Kurai. The Chrysai is called Kurai, handmaidens, helpers. But these are not just like the tripods. They're actually like real young women with sense and reason, voice also and strength, and all the learning of the immortals. Again, gold. So we get a golden robot. We get 2 golden robots for each leg one, obviously. And they're like real young women. So they're immediately mimetic. So they, on the one hand, they're replacing his disabled legs, right? So they're prostheses or extensions in the notion of McLuhan, and so they're extensions, but they're also like mimetic. They're mimetic because they're like real young women. So this is this incredibly beautiful construct of Homer. So we see again gold, shining, and self-movement directly connected via mimesis. Now let me just build on that. So we got this prosthetic as well as the mimetic in a sort of looping figure. and we get this idea of shining ornament and how that is related to self movement. Let's look at the meaning of the word ornament. I just want to do this sort of in between. Let's keep this idea of prosthetic and mimetic in the back of our minds. But ornament, so that means it has a lot of meanings, but it quite directly comes from equipment, trappings, even embellishments, of course, and apparatus. Now that word is I find very interesting because this directly connects to machines. So we got an ornament machine connection, but also apparatus has a double meaning in the sense of preparing and making ready. Right, so that's not just a making ready in the sense of we want to go, but we also want to sort of apply makeup or adorn ourselves to get out, so that to equip ourselves. So there's an enormous ambiguity in the background, and of course we know them as completely split and diverged into different worlds, one of pure appearances, another of a pure workings. An apparatus for us is this dark thing that does something, but has all these workings internally to it. An ornament that's all external, but that's not how it is here. They're strongly connected, and what I find really beautiful is this word "make ready," because there's many connections of the word ready in English to Germanic languages. Of course, I'm Dutch, so for me, ready is not just klaar, to be ready, but it's also gereed or gereedschap. So ready links very strongly to the idea of apparatus. Now, readiness is not an innocent term. You can see here it actually links to ride, so that's very specifically it relates to movement. This is another form of readiness at hand, so to speak. I know I'm like quoting Heidegger here, but this relates to a quite an opposite notion of to be ready at hand than what Heidegger thought. With Heidegger, it's called Zuhandenheit. It's of course especially well known now since Graham Harman philosophized on the whole idea of tool being, Zeugseins in Heidegger's language. But Zuhandenheit is opposed to Vorhandenheit. The Vorhandenheit is when technical objects appear, and they can only appear when they're broken. So that's the broken hammer. The moment something breaks, or when a knife is blunt, or when a door is jammed, or they appear to us. While in daily usage, of course, the knife is sharp, so you cut with it, and the door just opens. And Heidegger actually has this example. It's in German, Klinke. He talks about the lecture room of his university building, and he opens the door to the lecture room without any extra thought. And it's a very subliminal idea of action. So the latch, or the doorknob, the latch, I think Klink is actually latch, and that's a hiding of things. That sort of opposes directly to this idea of gold, right? So we have a readiness of things that are ready because they're ornate, they're embellished, they're overworked, so they're already part of consciousness. They already present themselves on the stage. Even before we see them, they're already part of consciousness. While for Heidegger, it's the reverse. Being sort of slips into our existence via sort of this absence of not showing. Now for Heidegger, that's because things are for themselves, and they show themselves to us for us. That means that the being goes before showing. So the Zuhandenheit comes before Vorhandenheit. And for him, readiness means staying in the dark. It's like, that's like your air conditioning waiting to happen, or it's like your lackey waiting to serve you, or your butler. So that's a typical idea of dienlichkeit, of service as something that's dark. But it's only dark not because these things are behind the curtain, but because we put them there. And because it's a viewpoint. And I think that's the strongest critique. I think whatever you want to say about the door handle being invisible, it's only invisible because you're not watching. So there's this continuity of action is only possible because it's the perspective from human consciousness. So though Heidegger is always critiquing phenomenology, right? Because it doesn't reason from being, but from experience and appearances. In fact, he takes the same perspective, because he takes the human perspective, where the door handle is not visible, and that's completely different in this Greek realm where everything shows itself. Where everything is gold and everything is embellished. Why? Because they offer themselves to you. So that's another type of consciousness that's not written from the consciousness of humans. It's actually written from the viewpoint of things. And I think that's why it's so powerful. It's a reversal. And I think that's why they dream so strongly about self-movement. Because there's an enormous power on the side of things, so and that's very different than Heidegger's idea of things hiding themselves. They're not hiding themselves; they're actually showing themselves. And let's not forget. I think this is actually Jacob von Uexküll, who says all our actions are mimetic. If we sit in a chair, if we go sit in a chair, we mimic the chair, of course. If we grab a latch with our hand mimics the door handle or the latch. So there is an appearance, and there's actually a strong intimacy between the door handle and the shape of the door handle and how it radiates, and your hand. So your hand sees it. Maybe you don't, but your hand sees it, like your body sees the chair, and your whole body sees the car. So there's this is a more radical idea, and I've called this radical in the previous lecture. In the part 1, I call this phenomenology, which is quite a reversal, obviously. So actually my argument is that Heidegger still takes a phenomenological point of view. If there is a withdrawal of things, that's only from the viewpoint of human consciousness. Because what the Greeks are saying is, no, these things are present, everything is present. And so even the gods are present, constantly shape-shifting. So that will be the argument. I want to go back to this prosthetic mimetic idea, because I think that's quite central to understanding, like how the relationship between, let's say, the side of appearances on the side of ornament and embellishment and hypergon, how that relates to this realm of the prosthetic of robots, of extending our limbs, and quite literally in the case of Hephaestus. So we are starting to understand more and more of the clubfeet of Hephaestus. It's not just that disability gives him a sort of orientation, how to detour towards things, and puts the emphasis on the extreme ability of his hands. No, it's really the robotics are a prosthetic notion of his limbs. Now that's where we want to go. And I'm going to look at puppetry. It's a pretty corny photo on the left. There's hardly any photos of puppetry where you see both the puppeteer and the puppet. So I've been trying to find one, but this is I think it's even before the Second World War. This is a very old one. Not that it matters. But it will be important for our argument. And the hanging puppet, and of course the standing puppeteer, and how they relate to each other. It's quite obvious. Sure, you can say there's an active person and a passive puppet, but that's a slight misunderstanding of let's say the psychology of what the relationship is between a puppet and a puppeteer. Obviously, the puppet is as active as the puppeteer. Is just an alternating relationship, and there's many movies where puppets psychologically take control over the puppeteer, and that's not by accident. So yes, the puppeteer is extending, in this case herself, through the threads and through the strings onto the puppet. But there's also a mimetic relationship from the puppet to the puppeteer, and that's where we will go. I'm showing a 1 or 2 pages of a beautiful book by Frank Wilson, a neurologist, and he has a chapter on puppeteering. Beautiful chapter, but it's already important because neuron means cord or string, and so a neurologist, I mean, it's a bit very over direct, but it is important because in the idea of consciousness, obviously in neurology, there's this idea of the controlling mechanism, or there was this idea that doesn't exist anymore, of the homunculus, who is then sitting there and then steering all the actions. So there's a homunculus sort of in a seat, and then there's these wires and strings, and pulling the strings. You can actually, I mean, neurologists learn the workings of muscles as students by looking at the arms and hands of corpses, severed hands and arms. You can actually pull at the muscles, and you will see the corresponding movements of the fingers. That's a sort of an extreme idea of the homunculus, but the homunculus is, in that sense, it's always understood as a passive figure who is then, or he's the active figure who is then steering the action of the body, who's passively receiving all those controls, which, of course, that this idea is completely replaced by something far more complex. He is describing that over here as a sort of on-off mechanism. There's not just contraction, there's also a relaxation at the same time. So there's something far more complex, a sort of a back and forth between a relaxation of certain muscles as well as contraction, of course, because if you contract one muscle, other muscles need to relax, or else it wouldn't bend. But of course, the problem of the homunculus is that what's called infinite regress, is that there's another figure then needs to be there to steer that homunculus, and another and another and another, and that's sort of how we get to this Russian dolls of consciousness. Obviously, it doesn't exist. What is interesting is that Frank Wilson befriends a puppeteer in Germany, and really goes quite far in trying to understand what exactly goes on in the art of puppeteering. And this German puppeteer says, let's look at this. It takes at least 3 years of work to say you are a puppeteer. The most difficult job technically is to be able to feel the foot contact, the floor, as it actually happens. So that's what we see here. It's like, how do you feel the way through your own chords and then through those chords? Right, so that's a string system. The only way to make the puppet look as though it is actually walking is by feeling what is happening through your hands. So your feeling extends over the threads, but of course feeling is interior, so we need to have a loop that goes back into the body. So there's an as if. The best puppeteer after some years will actually see what is happening on the stage as if he himself, he or her in this case, was located in the head of the puppet. Okay, so that's exactly what it is. Instead of looking out through the puppet's eyes, he must learn to be in the puppet. So that's a pure, I would call this sympathy. Sympathy is still involved in the gift cycle and these exchanges between the prosthetic and the mimetic, but it is a specific type of mimesis, and I think that's important to say, because we think of mimesis as looking in the mirror, as something that's flat, and that's why we call it reflective. There's this lack of depth. But every actor, well, actually actors often use mirrors, by the way. Every actor knows how laborious it is to stand in the shoes of a character, and that's the same what we get here. It takes 3 years. Well, it doesn't take an actor 3 years to become a character, but there is this process, this darkening of the figure. Of the other, and to make it actually part of the self. So to actually extend yourself into a character, you have to then incorporate that character. So that's not at all something that's reflexive. It's actually a form of absorption, and that fits with this back and forth loop that we get extension and absorption. We get something coming out as a self movement, as an extension of the self, and then there's this incorporation or absorption of the other. So this is, I think that's important to say, because I've been using the word mimesis pretty often, but it is not your typical imitation after nature. It is something far more complex, and that's exactly what we feel when we open the door. Or when we go sit in a chair, there's this internal mimesis. There's these points in the body, in the dark body structure, that imitate the shape of the chair or imitate the shape of the latch to actually open it. So there's this loop of what I before called the pheno axis and the techno axis, or an axis of working and an axis of appearing. Is that one transforms in the other constantly, and so that's so when we say prosthetic and mimetic, we actually mean a form of absorptive mimesis and not reflexive mimesis, being in the puppet. Now, really, the best text on this on this subject is Heinrich von Kleist's über das Marionettentheater, and it's a bit awkward. I'm showing a lot of Greek and French and in this case German. Of course, the book is properly translated in English. It's just there are many translations, and I don't agree with any of them fully. So I've been, like, when I wrote Grace and Gravity, I've been like quoting from different versions of translations. In this case, I'm just showing the German. I won't like explain it in German. I won't just hopefully I can translate it. But it's a text from Heinrich von Kleist, I think from 1810, and it's always viewed as a sort of parody on Friedrich Schiller's Über Anmut und Würde, and of course we discussed Schiller's text. Which is from 1793. I think Schiller obviously was already dead by the time von Kleist published this very, very short story. It's just like, what is it, 10, 12 pages or something. Very short. But in that sense, it cannot be a parody because Schiller wasn't there anymore. But it does use the word Anmut quite often, and it also uses another word, grazie, which are not exactly the same in German. Grazie is closer to Gnade, or is a slightly different form of Anmut. Anmut is really something that happens to the subject. And grazie is more something that is on the place of on the side of the object. That's why it's much better to write these things in English, because there the word grace sort of covers both positions and doesn't distinguish between them already, as in German. Now, what's really beautiful is that. This very short story is places grace in a larger context of puppetry, which almost makes it a Catholic text. Maybe we get to that, but also to automatisms. And that's why it's important for us here. And it starts with the narrator meeting the first dancer of the opera. So that's really the principal dancer. It's a really important dancer. So it's the main figure in the dance company, and very talented too. And what does the principal dancer tell the narrator? That he often visits the theater of marionettes to understand perfect forms of dancing, and this must seem ridiculous at first, because we think of dancing as something that comes out of the body. And not as a form of literally manipulation by an external entity. As you can see on the left, you get this sort of the wires, but he's very, very clear about this idea. Let's see how that works. We're going through like 5 or 6 pages. I'm not going to retell the story. It's almost like we're with this text. We are in the world of Haraway. It's like that there's because we get this equation of the human, and he actually calls it not a puppeteer, a machinist. This person is the machinist, somebody who sort of engineers the movements. And what are these movements? Let me see. Einzelne Glieder is in Punkten. So Glied is a limb, and the limbs are moving like like pendulums, welche nichts als Pendel wären. So what do we have is these limbs all have their own center of gravity. In this center of gravity, there's a vertical line that goes through them, and gerade Linie. So there's a vertical line, straight line going through them. But while they move over the hinges of the joints, obviously they create curves, and obviously you get multiple actions organized by multiple vertical lines, you get something else than just pure circles. Right? So if I move this one and that one all together, I get much more complex lines than mathematically speaking than simple circles. So he has a very mathematical way of looking at the movements of all the limbs in relationship to each other. It's almost like he's trying to understand contrapposto. And what shouldn't we have is like negative. So what we cannot have is tirerij. So what is tirerij means? Is affectation. So you cannot fake these movements. Now we go to Hephaestus. So you're talking about a puppet, or a complete mimetic concept, right? But this mimetic concept, it cannot fake its movements. So we understand like mimesis as a form of imitation, but these movements are as real and truthful as they should be, and truthful in the sense that they actually follow the soul, the vis motrix, this moving principle of our self movement, this principle of self movement of the human body. So he actually places the soul of movement in the center of in the center of gravity of each of the different limbs. And what's interesting is that the puppeteer, de machinist schlechthin vermindert, cannot really manipulate in the sense that we manipulate a shape in the sense that we can sort of shape it directly, because we can only use the threads. That's what he says. We can only use the wires or the strings, and so we cannot rotate them by ourselves. We can only sort of apply that verticality, and that applying of verticality makes these puppets anti-grav. Now that's not your typical German, but it means anti-gravity, which is a word you will never find in any other text. I haven't. And so there's this perfect lightness. Now, but of course the question is, of course, that this is two objects, so to speak. And he's talking about one dancer. Right? He's talking about one dancer. He's not talking about the choreographer pulling the threads of the dancer. No, he's talking about the dancer, how a dancer moves. He also describes actually bad dancers, and he uses their initials, and he says, yes, this one is moving against that center of gravity of the limb, so they will never reach this moment of pure grace. Now it's becoming like quite beautiful, and for us like really interesting. Just a few pages further on, it's the fifth page in the text, I think. Haben Sie dadurch einen Blick, haben Sie vor jedem mechanischen Beinen gehört, welche englische Künstler für Unglückliche verfertigen? So, die ihre Schenkel verloren haben. That means, have you ever watched these? So the dancer speaking to the narrator. Did you ever watch these mechanical legs that English artists make for disabled people that have lost their limbs, prostheses? So, and he says yes, of course. At the beginning, they have a problem with walking if they have like a wooden leg, a prosthetic leg. But then it becomes more and more natural. and completely incorporated in the bodily system, in the sort of mobile system of the body. A neurologist like Oliver Sacks would say, in the body image as a whole, this image of where all neurons are connected to each other. This creates at the end something of perfect rest, lightness, and grace. So he even goes so far to move from a dancer first to a puppet, and then from a puppet to somebody wearing prosthetics, and that creates a perfect movement. Why? Because every time you move, you can only move that center of gravity, and the limb will find its perfect movement. Now, on the left, this is a Roman copy of a Hellenic sculpture, a very famous sculpture, Boy with Thorn. A boy removing a thorn or a splinter from his foot. It's also called spinario in Italian. It's a very beautiful. This is and that's the narrator. He describes a young man. He knew a young man 3 years ago, and always walking with perfect movement and grace, Anmut. And he was 16 years old, and he had been in Paris to the exhibition where they saw I think the Roman copy of the statue, and that's this image. Incredibly beautiful sculpture. This is it's originally Hellenic. So the narrator and this boy saw the statue, and then later there in the baths, where the boy is sitting on a chair and all wet, and tries to like dry himself, and at a certain moment he is putting one leg over the other, and starts to dry his foot. And the moment he dries his foot, he actually looks in the mirror. He watches himself drying his foot in the mirror, and he's immediately remembers the statue that he saw in the exhibition in Paris, and he loses his grace completely. And the moment he sees himself in the mirror, his friend, who's the narrator, also sees him, and the narrator they exchange glances. Makes clear that he also understands the association with the original sculpture. The boy keeps on trying to sort of find that graceful act again, and like. Zum zweiten Mal, and he keeps on trying a second time, a third time, a fourth time, even to vierten, and he completely fails. He completely fails to find that grace again that they not just saw in the sculpture, but he also started sort of to feel when he started drying his foot, until he saw himself in the mirror. Now that's a very powerful explanation of reflective mimesis. Why is this statue so beautiful? This boy is completely absorbed. It is one figure, obviously, but there is the boy and his foot. The foot hurts, so the pain. And we've discussed pain pretty often with Frida Kahlo and the caryatids, and we saw the woman in crutches and the exoskeleton. There's pain there. So pain shows itself. It shows itself, and it separates the foot that you normally like the latch of Heidegger, the foot that you would normally not be conscious of, suddenly it shows itself. So between the boy and the foot, there's this mimetic relationship. There's this doubleness. So there's this loop between the foot and the boy, and he is not able to mimic that. Why? Because he is not in an absorptive mimesis, state of absorptive mimesis like the boy, but he's in a state of reflective mimesis because he's now conscious of what he's doing. So this consciousness actually breaks the act, and that's a stunningly beautiful idea. After this page, von Kleist goes on by describing somebody actually fencing, and fencing even with a bear, and all the feints and trickery do not work against the bear, and I'm skipping that part of the story. It's quite hilarious and beautiful too, and again it explains sort of this state of higher and lower consciousness, but especially this idea of reflective and absorptive mimesis. And what's really beautiful is like Kleist describes this loop as a ring-shaped world, as a ring-shaped world, a ringvormige Welt. And at the end of the text, he returns to that idea. He let's look at this. He says, wir sehen, dass in dem Maße, als in der organischen Welt die Reflexion dunkler und schwächer wird, die Grazie darin immer strahlender und herrschender hervortritt. So this is literally what we're saying. As when in the organic world, reflection or reflective consciousness retreats more and more, becomes darker and weaker. At that point, grace becomes more radiant and takes over. Right? But what actually takes over? Because there's no puppeteer here. There's no puppeteer here. So how does he actually construct that? And that's quite a stunning idea. Let's look at this. It's very complex. Because there's again a bit of mathematics involved. Doch so wie sich in den Durchschnitt zweier Linien auf einer Seite des Punkts den Durchgang durch das Unendliche plötzlich wieder auf die andere Seite finden. So what he's saying, there's two lines and you make a section. And of course lines, according to Euclid, always go to the infinite. So he's saying got two parallel lines. If you cut through them, one goes to the infinite. It actually comes back to you. Okay, and then oder das Bild des Hohlspiegels, that's the concave mirror. Now this is really interesting because a concave mirror is not a flat mirror. So we get the boy looking at the flat mirror and this idea of grace being broken or failing. We get now a concave mirror. So it's not... What he's not saying is, okay, we should always be unconscious. He's always like, grace is that form of pure spontaneity and naturalness. That's what normally would happen. So what you would say, look, against this reflective consciousness, we would say, you would have to have a non-conscious state of pure spontaneity, right? So something that acts without ever arriving at an appearance, purely from the inside out, staying purely in the world of workings, right, of immanence. That would be the word. So the transcendence of the reflective would be replaced by the immanence, right, of the non-reflective. But that's not what he's doing. He's actually accepting the notion of transcendence. So that vertical of the puppeteer, that remains. So what do we have here? It's a very complex construct. What he's in fact saying is like, okay, we are hanging here. Here are the lines, and then there's this concave mirror. You know, that does two things. One is it brings that line to the infinite. which is an idea very close to, let's say, Leibniz's idea of a deity that's infinite, right? But via the infinite, so that we got a curved mirror, via the infinite, it returns. So again, it's prosthetic as well as mimetic. But it's a very different type of mimesis. It's an inside-out mimesis. An inside-out mimesis that is absorptive. So we got this figure that is not against the verticality of transcendence, actually uses that notion of transcendence, of that vertical, but it actually allows it to bend back. So that's the hanging in itself. That's the hanging in itself. Now let's compare that idea of this hanging in itself and this concave mirror to another piece of rope, another string, another thread that we know from Brideshead Revisited, and we know Evelyn Waugh was a Catholic. And so with Catholicism we get of course this general idea of grace, but it's always separated in two. One is resistible, the other is irresistible grace. It goes a bit too far to, I mean, that would be another lecture or another 10 lectures to go into that. But I would just like to sort of compare these two types of threads, and I think that's what's so interesting. In Brideshead, not sure if you know the story. We got this family, a very Catholic family in England. So that's a very old family. So there's a lot of repression involved. They're very rich, but they have their own chapel on the grounds. Of course, we know the famous TV series, with Jeremy Irons as Charles Ryder, who's the main character, or the narrator, who befriends Sebastian in Oxford. And Sebastian is from that large family, or from that rich family, the Marchmain family, and he has two sisters. One is Julia, the other is Cordelia, and Sebastian's an incredibly interesting figure. He becomes more and more an alcoholic. He fails in Oxford, and he becomes like in a desperate state. Ends up like in the north of Africa, living together with another man, and that's not so important. What's important is that, of course, he's Sebastian, so that's Saint Sebastian, and so that's a life of hurt and suffering. And there's at a certain moment, like in the middle of the book, it's not this passage, in the middle of the book, Sebastian is extremely drunk. So this rich family is like reading a book downstairs, and Sebastian comes down and enters the room completely drunk. But they're discussing the mother of Sebastian, the mother of the family, the most Catholic family member, who's been separated actually from her husband, Lord Marchmain, who lives in Venice, an apostate who at the end famously converts on the deathbed. Anyway, it's not so important. But what is important is that she's reading Father Brown by G.K. Chesterton. G.K. Chesterton, another Catholic, but Chesterton describes Father Brown as catching a thief. It's a detective story, right? It's the famous priest who becomes a detective in his free time. He catches that thief with an unseen hook and an invisible line which is long enough to let him wander to the ends of the world and still bring him back with a twitch upon the thread. This is a central sentence of the book, the unseen hook. That's the classic image of Catholicism and grace. And so there's a free will, there's free will, and which means that that is this sort of wandering to the ends of the world, and then the twitch on the thread. Twitch upon the thread is, of course, God exerting the power of grace. So that's the transcendent vertical line. So we have Sebastian here as a puppet, always like wandering around, self-movement, and then connected to grace with a twitch upon the thread, which you can then either resist or not resist. There's two schools in grace theory, in grace in theology, Catholic theology. That's not really the same as this. That's not really the same as this. They look similar, but they're not. Though you might argue here that yes, that might be. But there's two wills, two willpowers. So one is of humans that wander around the world, and then there's God with his willpower, and that willpower is called grace. It's a completely mistaken idea of grace, that there's that there's two spaces. There's a space here and there's a space there, which are connected through the vertical axis of transcendence, and then you can actually occupy that space and you can pull at a thread. That's the classic homunculus of religious thinking, that there is a second figure. That's not exactly what von Kleist is doing. But again, Kleist is not declaring that everything is nature like Spinoza and then saying, okay, now let's replace this idea of transcendence, this idea of the sky hook, as Daniel Dennett calls it, the sky hook. There's this a chapter in Daniel Dennett where I think it's a pilot who's crashing, and he gets advice over the radio from ground controls, and he's saying, well, there are no sky hooks, so I have to do it by myself. And so Daniel Dennett is using this metaphor of a sky hook as a sort of sarcastic model of transcendence. The problem is to understand space and the gap, what we call the gap, as two spaces. There's no way you can occupy the gap. The gap cannot be occupied. The relationship between space and the gap is one of transcendence. That's why the vertical line is so important in our story. This vertical axis of standing. But you can't sit there. You can't sit there. Yes, there's no homunculus. There's no God in that sense. You could argue, though, and I think that's what von Kleist is doing, that God is not that figure. That's because Christ is the figure. We discussed that at the end of the ornament discussion, because he's hanging like a puppet, but God is the gap. So that would not be the figure in the gap or in that second space, but it's actually the gap itself, the notion of the gap. I'd say that's closer to what Kleist is doing. This is like because he says, no, it's not a question of replacing this idea of transcendence with one of immanence, where everything is horizontal and just bubbles up. No, there is actually transcendence, but it's a form of infinite. It's this looping back. So you're extending yourself almost like a boomerang. You're extending yourself, and it comes back to you. So you're like hanging in yourself. Quite a marvelous idea, and so I would be okay to actually to say from Evelyn Waugh's idea of the unseen hook as something similar, as long as you don't sort of posit a figure, or you posit a willpower there, because it's clearly not a willpower. It's the alignment. I think that would be the way of saying it, and that's why I always come back to Theseus and the Minotaur. It's an alignment of free will obviously, and that what happens to you. And I think we are going very close to Nietzsche here in this amor fati. But that is what we also discussed with athletes. The figure of the athletes is there is a making happen. There's a making happen. So that's willpower. There's a making happen. But there is also a letting go, or a letting happen, and that's where they become passive. That's where they become passive athletes. So it's not pure activity to win, right? To shine and to become I think you can also lose by doing that, but that's not what we're discussing. This is this extending of yourself by willpower, and then letting go, and then letting it happen to you. Right? That's very close to St. Paul, by the way, who says, okay, there's this law of works and there's this law of grace, but they're not simply opposed. They're not simply opposed. It's really that finding grace is really that finding of workings. But on the level of consciousness, I think it's even more important, because we've been discussing a bit of consciousness when we get to Heidegger first, but also to the neurologist. Free will, of course, means that you're the driver, right? That you're conscious of your situation, and this infinite concave mirror is much more a shared consciousness. It's like this sharing of consciousness, what happens between the puppet and the puppeteer, right? So there's this loop of consciousness, and in this case, it's distributed consciousness, or it's a cosmic consciousness of universe, because it's infinite in the idea of von Kleist. Now, I just want to link that back to the idea of the labyrinth and the thread. Just wanted to note that it's no accident that Theseus is holding this thread. We know this story as a simple, Ariadne gave him the thread, but the thread plays an incredibly important role in this whole idea of finding the way, transfiguring, and then finding the way out. It's almost like a prefiguration, figuration, transfiguration, and then refiguring. It's more than a loop. It's like you're spiraling in and then spiraling out. So and the spiral is a concept of vertigo or the vertical. So it's where you lose yourself. It's where you lose yourself, and that point where you lose yourself, you grow these horns, you radiate. And at that point, when you go back via the threads, and that thread, of course, is fate, and Nietzsche calls it amor fati, but that's not just a stoic. It's not just a stoic acceptation of fate. It's because the stoic acceptation of fate is tranquil, that you don't resist the things that happen to you, but you actually allow them to happen. That's not Nietzsche's idea. Nietzsche says we have to love it. And loving, he describes loving as becoming second nature. So you have to train yourself. You have to train yourself to start loving it till it becomes second nature. So it's really a notion of training. And a training or a therapy that allows you to love, and love is something of beauty in Nietzsche. It's not this simple acceptation. It's accepting of fate. It's really a loving, and loving means the love for things, things that shine, that are beautiful. Right? What did he say? Everything that's beautiful once, twice, thrice, over and over. So this cyclical idea, of course, eternal recurrence, is exactly what this rope is all about. So this rope is precisely the line of the puppet to the puppeteer and the line back. It's not just a line that goes down, it's actually a line that goes back up. It's also the line of Kleist, the very much more complex line where the puppeteer becomes this curved mirror of absorption and a sort of an external consciousness. That is the same line here, the same thread, the same rope, and that's of course why when Theseus returns back to Delos, is doing the crane dance. The crane dance, this sometimes even called the snake dance, because the cranes, when they dance, they create these very complex winding patterns on the ground. So it's often understood as the crane dance is not something that is elevated. And about cranes, it's much more about the type of movements they do. Anyway, he is repeating the movements as a dance. Now, we already know from much earlier descriptions of the labyrinth that it's not a building, but it's a dance. And it's a spiraling dance on the orchestra, the choros, the round dance, the spiraling dance, which is it becomes the dance of fate. And here we see Clotho, the first who spins the thread of fate. Of course, there are three. That's a triad again, and the Moirai, like the Horai, and the Charites, the graces. The Charites are connected by a piece of cloth, and the Moirai are connected by a thread that is cut at the end. Obviously, but this is the moment of the spinning. So I think these two actually fit on top of each other. This idea of fate and accepting radiance, loving fate, and then transforming yourself, and then finding the way out in this beautiful little drawing by Burne-Jones. I think this concludes our lecture on the figure of hanging. Thank you.